So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Just by way of introduction, I'll give you my usual disclaimer. So my job at Auckland Council is to provide an objective, even-handed view on economic questions. It's not to be a cheerleader for council if there are policies that I mightn't think are the best economic solution. But that does mean that you have to think about what I'm saying today as my own views. Some of these are shared by councillors and by staff, and others may not be. But please don't leave and tell everyone, Auckland Council's about to do this if it's something that I've suggested, because that just isn't necessarily the case. Okay, so what I'm going to cover today, firstly, estimating the current housing shortfall. Is there a shortfall? How big is it? Then what we're building, how that's changing. And there's actually quite an exciting story in there, which is an antidote to some of the ideas that we do see floating around there, I believe. Thirdly, some of the affordability challenges that we have. And finally, I'll present you with a scenario of growth, which really brings us back to the first point in terms of that shortfall. Do we have any hope of overcoming it? And that's quite an interesting but perhaps slightly shocking picture too. Okay, so estimating the current shortfall. Early last year, I publicly suggested that our calculations were that we had a housing shortfall a little bit over 40,000 in Auckland. There were some, I got a bit of hate mail on that. I was accused by some of being a left-wing liberal. And then the RBNZ and MB came out with their estimates, and suddenly I was a right-wing conservative, okay, because I was saying mid-40s and they were saying that or higher. Since then, we've continued to not build enough homes for the growth in our population. So not only do we have a shortfall, but the shortfall is growing because we're still not building enough. We're building a lot more. I'll talk about that soon, but it's still not enough. And so I estimate that our shortfall is now over 46,000. Okay, so what are we building? Well, you saw this slide earlier in Deputy Mayor Cashmore's presentation. He didn't give me the credit, but that's okay. And what this shows us is that from a very low base in consenting activity back in 2012, this was post-GFC, consenting activity had absolutely plummeted away through several years of weakness in the economy. From late 2011, Auckland's economy began to get stronger again, and we started to see an uptick in consenting activity. And you could pretty much draw a straight line, that red line over there, through the annual increase in the total number of consents that we were issuing. That relationship broke in April 2016, and my suspicion at the time was that that was linked to the impending introduction of the new Auckland Unitary plan, which, as you've heard earlier today, was a plan that consolidated all the legacy plans from the old councils that had been amalgamated to form the new Auckland Council, simplifying zoning and massively upzoning swathes of Auckland, both brownfield and greenfield. And so my suspicion was, well, perhaps it's a matter of people saying we've bought the land. We're starting to get a very clear picture about where increased density is going to be possible, and so we'll wait until the plan's operative and then we'll lodge our building consents and so on, because that'll allow us to put in a lot more density than we could otherwise put on the land. The plan became operative in November 2016, and I thought, well, it'll probably be about 5 months before we begin to see any uptick in consenting activity. 5 months came and went, 6 months came and went, 7 months, 8 months, and it ended up taking 9 months. So I was wrong on the timing, but in terms of the pattern that we're now seeing, I was absolutely right, and I'll show you why in a minute. So what we saw is in that 15-month period, really slow growth of only about 6% a year. And then since August 2017, when we started to see an uptick in consenting activity in the 11 months since, we've seen an increase of 25% in building consents. I've also got the figure on CCCs here because I think it's important to say, well, not only are we consenting things, but are we delivering them? Obviously, there's a big lag between getting a building project consented and then actually delivering it. And as we switch to more multi-unit developments, that lag will lengthen because they're more complex projects. They take longer to build. But what is exciting is to see that over this period, growth in CCCs issued is actually even stronger than consents. So we're kind of closing some of that gap And it looks like we are finding ways to get that final sign-off completed faster. So that's quite encouraging. But now, why do I say that I think this is the Unitary plan working? And again, Councillor Cashmore had this up earlier. He had a slightly earlier version, which I had to send him a week ago. This one's got a bit more data in it. We've now got the 11 months. But what this shows us clearly is that even though we have now zoned for a lot more growth outside brownfields areas, as well as a lot of growth in brownfields areas, given the increased choice that the Unitary plan's delivered, guess where people want to be? They actually want to be close to their jobs. They don't want to sit in traffic for an hour to get to work by building 40 k's away. And so what we see is that 85% of all the growth in consenting activity in the comparable 11-month period has been in brownfield areas, not in greenfield areas. In terms of local board areas, I won't go through this in much detail. Some of it's pretty obvious. We've split this up into houses in blue, if you can't read it from the back of the room. Other multi-units, that's townhouses and terraces in the grey, and apartments in the red. As you'd expect, Waitemata, where you are right now, the central city, is where we see the most apartments being built. That's obvious. But what's quite exciting to see is, again, through enablement via the Unitary plan, we're getting a lot more development in some of the other local board areas on the isthmus and just across the harbour bridge. So places like Albert Eden, Devonport, Takapuna, and a little bit further up in Upper Harbour. In terms of terraces, again, you're seeing quite a surprising mix in terms of where it's happening. Places like Papakura, quite a long distance away from the CBD, but linked by train, we're seeing more terraces going in there. And then, as you would expect, houses, standalone houses on the 800 square metre section are still the norm in places around the fringes of the city, so Rodney and Franklin, for example. Upper Harbour is the one interesting case here because we've got such a mix between standalones, terraces, and apartments. They're actually delivering such a wide range of typologies. And then the other interesting thing, in terms of why brownfield growth is where I would like to see most growth and where the market would like to see most growth, is again that accessibility issue. Now, it will be impossible for you to read this map. It's impossible for me to read it, and I'm right in front of it, but I'll tell you what it says, okay? The red dots are where we're consenting multi-unit dwellings. The bigger the dot, the bigger the number of dwellings consented on that consent application. Blue is standalone homes, and hopefully you can see sort of a purple slithery line through the city and a little bit up there on the North Shore. Well, that is our rapid transit network catchment, and we've defined that as walk-up distances of 1,500 metres to rapid transit. So not your regular buses, only your trains and only the Northern Busway. And what we have found, as the map kind of shows, but I think this chart shows much better, is that although the rapid transit network only accounts for a minute sliver of Auckland's total land area, 2.6%, the tiny little red sliver on the right-hand side, 16 times its share of land area is this figure in the middle, the red bar in the middle, the big one, is its share of multi-unit development. In other words, it's delivering a much larger, 16 times bigger share of all multi-units than you'd expect given its share of land area. Guess what? People like to live close to rapid transit networks because it's a smart idea. It gets them to work, it gets them where they need to go. And even on standalones, we're delivering about 4 times more standalone dwellings within those catchments than the size of that area would suggest, okay? And then the rest split across the rest of the urban area and then outside the urban area in greenfields areas. Okay, one other thing I'd like to talk about in terms of what we're building. We've talked about typologies, talked about where we're building, but this is really interesting as well. It's a little bit more detail on the types of dwellings we're building, but it shows the shift in preferences in an economic sense, a lot of it possibly driven by budget constraints, but nevertheless changes that we're seeing. The black line shows you the average size of a dwelling we're consenting in Auckland over the last 5 years. It has fallen by 42 square metres, which is really quite a significant fall. So what's driving this? Well, number one is the switch in typologies. So apartments and terraces tend to be smaller than standalone homes. So as the share of dwellings delivered in Auckland has gone from 37% multi-unit to 53%, so now more than half of all dwellings delivered in just 2 years, on the back of these changes that we've brought about, we're seeing that shift to multi-unit dwellings being consented. So that explains a chunk of it, but with the kind of ugly arrows that I've just put in there, I want to show you a couple of other things. Firstly is what's happened to the average size of standalone homes. They are still embarrassingly large at 232 square meters, even though we have 3 people on average per dwelling in Auckland. There were 5 of you in your house, in your 1950s bungalow growing up, and you had 1 bathroom and 3 bedrooms and 100 square meters. But what's interesting is that the average size of those houses is beginning to also taper off at the same time as we're seeing this lift in the average size of terraces or townhouses. And this appears to be as people are making that switch between the standalone home further away and the terrace that costs a little bit less. It's on more valuable land. It's because of its amenity. It's closer to jobs. But they're now demanding slightly bigger townhouses, but again, significantly smaller than the standalone homes. And then the other interesting trend is what's happening in apartments. That's gone the other way. And that's because post the 2002 to 2004 building boom, where we produced thousands of shoebox apartments in Auckland that plummeted in value as soon as the Chinese student market disappeared almost overnight, apartments became something that empty nesters or relatively wealthy people tended to purchase. You know, the nice ones around here, down at the waterfront and so on. And so apartments tended to be quite large, up to 150 square meters, okay? And these are annual averages, by the way, so it's not skewed by data in just 1 month. That bounced around a little bit, but it has actually declined quite sharply, and over the last 2 years, it's declined particularly sharply from about 130 to 100 square meters per dwelling. And this is as apartment living has now become more accepted as a normal thing. And people are actually choosing to live in apartments now, and it's not just the rich and famous with the waterfront view apartment or penthouse. It's actually regular families choosing to live in apartments, often close to rapid transit networks or other PT that allows them, A, to own their own home, and B, to have quicker access to amenities. Okay, so what about affordability? So I had to send this presentation through a couple of days ago, and we got new REINZ data out yesterday, but the pattern remained exactly as expected. House prices peaked in about October 2016 in seasonally adjusted terms. Buyers and sellers tip. Prices always fall in January and always rise in March, so don't just take the media reports on that at face value when they tell you the world's imploding or booming based on 1 month's data. You've got to seasonally adjust, okay? So they peaked over there. They troughed actually just a few months ago, and what we've seen is house prices bobbing along in this range for about 2 years now. House prices at the moment, yesterday's number was pretty much flat lines, down slightly, about 0.4% within that same bar that I've got up there. And that has to make us ask why. So house prices grew, we've still got population growth, why aren't house prices going up more? Or why aren't they plummeting through the floor the way that people talk about so often in the media? Well, this is our affordability picture, okay? This is a measure that looks at the 3 things that affect house prices. It's not just about median multiples, the difference between the price of your property and your income, or the ratio. That's quite a simplistic way to look at it. House prices are high, and on that measure they are unaffordable, and that's true. I'm not disputing that. But there are other things that mean that the right median multiple is probably not 3. And those are things like interest rates, the fact that they are half what they were before the GFC. And then the other thing is your ability to save for a deposit. So as house prices have doubled in Auckland, your need for a deposit has effectively doubled, but your income's only gone up 40% in that period. That's creating another hurdle for people to actually get in the front door. But what's actually kind of interesting is that since house prices have flattened, interest rates have remained low, and incomes have continued to rise, affordability now is actually better than it's been for 3.5 years, which is kind of interesting, but nevertheless unaffordable for many, many people. I'll touch on that more in a second. So why flat prices? Why not lower? Why not higher? Well, here's a bunch of things. You can add to that now the foreign buyers ban. These are factors that will all have marginal effects on restricting prices or price growth. Remember, economists operate at the margins. These are all factors. None of them is the one explanation for why house prices have become flat and are not rising further despite population growth. But these are the range of factors. I don't have time to go into them now. Nevertheless, here is some work that we did about a month ago and published, looking at what's happened to affordability for various income brackets in Auckland over the last 5 years. And what we found, if I just focus on the median income household, because that's typically where people kind of measure these things, in 2012, the household on the median income could afford 48%, basically half, of all the dwellings available for purchase in Auckland in that calendar year. Today it's 18%. And you've got similar patterns just above and below that median. In fact, the biggest decline in affordability has been experienced by those middle income groups. Sadly, those at the bottom, have never been able to afford a home, or not in the last many years, and probably won't be able to for the next several years. But it's that middle group that has seen that dream of home ownership disappear. This is from the same report, and if you think of KiwiBuild, and by the way, I'm a fan of KiwiBuild. I don't think it's going to solve everything, but I think it is quite a good idea to develop a market for sub-$650,000 homes in Auckland, because the market's not delivering it on its own. But if we look at who can afford to buy those homes, well, in terms of household incomes, basically no one on the 40th, 45th, 50th, and maybe someone on the 55th percentile income could afford a house at that maximum price point, okay? Now, the minister's been quite clear. The goal is to deliver a significant number of houses below that cap of 650,000. What this tells us is, yes, we certainly will have to if we're going to make home ownership possible for people even on the median income in Auckland. This is my final slide, a scenario of growth. I said I'd come back to it. It links back to where we started. I said we're 46,000 dwellings short in Auckland. Okay, here's a scenario. If at the snap of my fingers we can increase housing delivery by 20%, so we're up at about, I showed you an 11-month figure earlier of 8,800 CCCs, it's about 9,500 that we're delivering. So if we can raise that to 11,000 or so, 11 to 12,000, if we can reduce our current population growth rate by 25%, so back more towards the Stats NZ medium growth projections, which we have exceeded. We've exceeded the high projections for several years now. And we built at that level with that much slower population growth, we're still going to be 30,000 dwellings short in 9 years. This is the scale of the challenge that we're facing. We need to be open to whatever options are available to deliver more housing faster if we're going to deliver to a wider range of people than we currently are. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.